There are nights when the world feels quieter than it should be, not peaceful, the kind of quiet that settles over an abandoned street at 3 a.m., the kind you only notice when you suddenly realize you've been holding your breath for years. If you've ever lived with depression or drifted close enough to its border to recognize the terrain, you know that silence well. It's the silence of an inner world shutting down, one small switch at a time, so slowly that by the time you finally notice, half the lights inside you have already gone dim. I remember being young, too young to understand the vocabulary of pain, and feeling something heavy push itself into my chest. Adults called it sadness because that was the closest word they had. But sadness always felt like the wrong shape. Sadness was supposed to move, to rise and fall, to swell and fade. This thing didn't move. It just sat there, cold, dense, still. And I didn't know it then, but that stillness, that quiet, was the beginning of depression's architecture forming inside me. In the United States, we grow up saturated with words, millions of them, and yet somehow we lack the ones that matter most. We know how to describe sports, weather, politics, trends, but the texture of emotional pain, that stays unspoken. Not because we don't feel it, but because this particular type of pain doesn't scream. It whispers. It hides behind functioning, behind humor, behind being fine. It hides behind the polite armor so many Americans wear every day. Depression doesn't always begin with devastation. Sometimes it begins with a quiet recalibration of your inner compass, one that slowly points you away from yourself. And what makes it even more frightening is that it often starts long before you recognize it. Maybe in middle school, maybe earlier, maybe at the first moment you realize there were emotions inside you that adults couldn't translate, couldn't validate, couldn't hold. When you're young, it slips into the background as you try to adapt, changing schools, changing friendships, learning the exhausting choreography of adolescence. You assume the heaviness is just part of growing up. You assume everyone feels this way, but somehow just handles it better. And so, you say nothing. Then adulthood arrives and the world grows noisier. Work, relationships, expectations, the constant pressure to stay productive, stay engaged, stay on. Meanwhile, inside you, the quiet grows louder. That is captured with painful accuracy. The return of depression in adulthood doesn't feel like an invasion. It feels like a familiar room you swore you'd never enter again. A room you hoped had been sealed off by time and growth. But it's still there. It always was. And here's the part we don't talk about enough. Depression doesn't always come back because something bad happened. Sometimes it returns because the nervous system never learned another path. According to cognitive psychology, the brain tends to revert to familiar emotional states during periods of overwhelm, even if those states are destructive. The neural circuits built in adolescence, especially during chronic stress or emotional neglect, tend to reemerge in adulthood when life becomes too heavy to navigate consciously. That means this isn't a weakness. This isn't you failing again. This is your brain returning to the only emotional blueprint it had at the time. For many Americans, especially those who learned early on to push through, to tough it out, to keep going no matter what, this blueprint becomes the default mode. Shut down, disconnect, go silent, endure. Depression is not just sadness amplified. It is selfhood muted. It is the slow erosion of your ability to feel anchored in the world. It is the quiet terror of waking up one day and realizing you're living inside your life, but no longer inside yourself. Some people describe it as darkness. Others describe it as heaviness. But for many, and this is the part most never admit, depression feels like becoming hollow. Not broken, not destroyed, just emptied. And in that emptiness, every sound inside you grows louder. Your doubts, your fears, your past, your belief that something in you has always been off, even though you could never prove it. This is the core pain we're exploring, the slow diminishing of your inner world until the person you used to be feels like a memory you can touch, but not inhabit. This is where the story begins. There's a certain kind of night that doesn't feel like nighttime at all. It feels like an abandoned hallway in a building no one remembers owning. Lights buzzing faintly, air standing still, shadows stretching longer than they should. The kind of night where you sit on the edge of your bed, and realize you've been staring at the wall for 20 minutes without knowing what you were thinking about. Or if you were thinking at all. I keep remembering a scene I once witnessed in a small town outside Portland. A man, maybe mid-30s, was sitting alone in a laundromat at 11 p.m. Neon light flickered through the dusty windows, turning the room into a kind of dull aquarium. He wasn't scrolling his phone. He wasn't reading. He wasn't even watching the clothes tumble behind the glass. He was just there, hands loosely clasped, shoulders barely holding their shape, eyes open but not really seeing. At first I thought he looked bored, but as I stood there waiting for my own dryer to finish, something shifted. There was a heaviness in the air around him, an invisible weight sitting on his chest, making every breath feel like a quiet negotiation. He wasn't wasting time. He was drifting inside it. A woman came in carrying a basket overflowing with clothes. She brushed past him, offering a polite smile. He didn't notice. Or maybe he noticed and didn't have the energy to react. It struck me then. This wasn't indifference. It was a kind of emotional frostbite. The moment when your inner world has been cold for so long that you stop feeling the burn of it. Outside, cars passed on the empty street, headlights sweeping across the windows. Each time the light hit his face, you could see the faintest flicker of something. Not emotion exactly, but a memory of it, like a faded photograph left too long in the sun. When his dryer finally beeped, he didn't move right away. He sat there for a full minute, as if gathering the fragments of willpower required just to stand. And when he finally did, it wasn't decisive. It wasn't the kind of movement that comes from being ready to leave. It was the kind that comes from no longer having a reason to stay. We all have moments like that laundromat night, moments where the world feels muted, like someone turned the volume down on reality. You go through your routines, your obligations, your conversations. You nod where you're supposed to. You smile because it's expected. But inside, everything is echoing. Everything is far away. For some people, this numbness comes suddenly. After a breakup, a loss, a disappointment that hit harder than they expected. For others, it arrives slowly, like dust settling on furniture you stopped caring about years ago. And then one day, you look around the room of your life and realize it's been quiet, for too long. There's a saying in neuroscience, systems shut down before they break down. And when I watched that man in the laundromat, it hit me that maybe this is what we do too. We withdraw before we collapse. We go silent before we shatter. We numb out because feeling everything at once would be unbearable. And yet, there was something strangely human about him. The way he kept showing up for the small tasks of living, even when his inner world was dim. Folding clothes, setting timers, being physically present in the mundane routines that anchor us when our minds drift too far from shore. I never spoke to him. I never knew his story. But the image stayed with me because somewhere inside that flickering neon room, I realized I wasn't just observing a stranger. I was watching a version of all of us. The part that goes quiet when life becomes too loud. The part that slips into the background when the world demands more than we have to give. The part that keeps breathing even when the mind has stopped keeping count. That night, as I walked back to my car, the cold air hit my face and brought me abruptly back into myself, into the feeling of a heartbeat, a breath, a moment that was undeniably alive. And I wondered how long it had been since he felt something like that. Not happiness, not excitement, just aliveness. Sometimes that's the hardest emotion to access when numbness takes over. Not joy, not sorrow. Just the quiet certainty that your life still belongs to you. There's a line I come back to often. Numbness isn't the absence of emotion. It's the nervous system hitting the emergency brakes. It sounds dramatic, but the brain is a dramatic organ. When something threatens your emotional stability, overwhelm, chronic stress, prolonged sadness, too much responsibility, too much unpredictability, your system steps in with a last resort strategy. It reduces sensation. Not to punish you, to protect you. Inside the brain, two systems operate like twin levers, the threat system and the reward system. Most people think numbness is a sign of not caring, but it's not that simple. What usually happens is a slow, quiet imbalance between these two levers. When stress becomes constant, not loud, dramatic stress, but the kind that hums in the background of daily life, the The brain starts increasing activity in the amygdala, the region that scans for danger. It becomes hypervigilant, always monitoring, always preparing, always predicting. Meanwhile, the reward system, the dopamine circuit, stretching through the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens, starts to dim. Not turn off, just dim, like a room where the lights flicker and eventually settle into a dull glow. This creates an emotional paradox. Your brain is on high alert, but you feel nothing. It's not that emotions disappear, it's that your internal processing becomes overloaded, and the brain chooses the path of least harm, shutting down some of the feeling channels so your system doesn't burn out. Imagine an electrical grid trying to keep a city running during a storm. If one area is overwhelmed, the system cuts power to another area to prevent a catastrophic overload. It's frustrating, but it's survival. That's what emotional numbness is, a survival pattern. And because the brain doesn't have a way to selectively numb only the painful things, it ends up numbing everything: enjoyment, hope, motivation, curiosity. This is why people say things like, "I don't feel sad, but I don't feel happy either," or "I'm not breaking down, but I'm not really living." The system is in what neuroscientists call a hypo-reward state. The circuits that generate anticipation and desire, the spark that makes you want to get out of bed, call someone back, open the blinds, try again, are stuck in low power mode. And here's a detail most people overlook. When you experience numbness for a long time, the brain adapts. It starts treating numbness as the new normal. Neural pathways reorganize around it, reinforcing the sense of distance, flatness, detachment. That's why snapping out of it never works. You can't snap out of something your brain has restructured itself to maintain. But there's a deeper mechanism underneath this. Something I don't hear many people talk about: predictive coding. Your brain isn't reacting to reality. It's reacting to what it predicts is going to happen. And if it predicts that experiences won't bring joy, that relationships won't feel safe, that effort won't pay off, it saves energy by numbing your anticipation before you even act. It's not the absence of feeling, it's the absence of expectation. This is why numbness often shows up in people who are highly responsible, highly self-aware, or highly pressured, because their brain has spent years predicting that being on is the only safe way to live. Eventually, the system tires, but instead of collapsing, it withdraws into a muted version of itself. And if you've ever wondered why numbness feels both peaceful and horrifying at the same time, here's why. When the threat system is high but the reward system is low, the brain ends up in a state that's neither dangerous nor safe. It's more like emotional limbo, a suspended state where nothing hurts, but nothing moves. It's the silence after an alarm, the quiet after chaos, a stillness that feels protective at first, until you realize you can't get out of it. Another thing, people often blame themselves for being numb, as if they chose it. But numbness isn't chosen, it's recruited. Recruited by a nervous system that has learned you've been carrying too much for too long. Recruited when your emotional bandwidth gets spent on survival instead of connection. Recruited when life demands more emotional output than your brain can safely provide. And even though it feels personal, it's not. It's mechanical, predictable, biological, a system running a safety protocol. But the most important part, and the part that's hardest to believe when you're numb, is that numbness isn't permanent. Neural circuits are plastic. They change with repetition, exposure, and experience. The same way a city reroutes electricity after a blackout, the brain can rebuild emotional pathways once the overload decreases. It's slow, subtle, inconveniently quiet. But it happens, not through force, not through willpower, but through small signals, moments of safety, moments of genuine connection, moments where the system realizes it no longer needs to brace for impact. Moments that remind the brain, feeling safe again. There's something quietly devastating about numbness that most people never name. It convinces you that the emptiness is a personal flaw, instead of a psychological response. In therapy rooms, clinicians often describe numbness as a protective detachment, not detachment from life, detachment from emotional overwhelm that once felt too heavy to carry. It's a pattern that usually forms slowly, not through dramatic trauma, but through the repeated experience of being the one who held everything together when no one held you, the kid who learned not to cry, the teenager who handled their own problems. the adult who became the stable one, even when stability came at the cost of their internal world. Many people who feel numb also have a long history of emotional self-containment, a habit of shrinking, softening, or silencing their emotions to avoid burdening others. Psychology calls this compulsive self-reliance, often seen in avoidant patterns and high-functioning depression. But here's the part that cuts deeper. You don't realize you've been carrying too much until the feelings disappear. That disappearance isn't failure, it's exhaustion. It's the moment the emotional system says, I can't keep processing at this intensity anymore, so I'm shutting down to keep you alive. And when the shutdown happens, the mind tries to make sense of it. It interprets the quiet as evidence. I'm broken. I'm disconnected. I'm losing myself. But the numbness isn't proof of damage. It's evidence that you've been surviving at full capacity for far too long. Think about this. Most emotions don't vanish. They retreat. They sink beneath the threshold of conscious awareness. They become stored, contained, suspended. What you feel as nothing is often a combination of three psychological mechanisms intertwined. 1. Emotional over-control. Some people are natural over-controllers, not because they're rigid, but because they once lived in environments where emotions were unpredictable or unsupported. So they learned to suppress expression to stay safe. Over time, suppression becomes automatic. You don't choose it. Your nervous system performs it for you. 2. Learned futility. This is one of the most misunderstood parts of numbness. When the brain learns, through repeated experiences, that expressing your emotions doesn't change anything, it stops trying. The shutdown feels passive, but it's really a learned response. Why feel something that leads nowhere? Psychologists call this learned helplessness. But I think the term is too harsh. It's more like learned conservation. Your system is saving energy where it once wasted effort. 3. Protective distancing. When life demands too much emotional labor, caregiving, high-stress jobs, constant conflict, endless uncertainty, the mind distances itself from the emotional impact to keep functioning. You feel detached from your life, not because you're apathetic, but because you've been in survival mode for too long. And here's a detail many people never catch. Numbness often shows up most strongly during periods of normalcy, after the crisis, after the urgency, after the chaos. Because when things finally calm down, your system finally has space to process, and the processing is too overwhelming. So instead of processing, it shuts down. That's why people say, I've been fine for months. Why am I numb now? Because numbness doesn't appear in the storm. It appears in the quiet after. And if you've ever noticed that numbness makes you feel like you're watching your life from somewhere behind your own eyes, that's not imagination. That's dissociation in its mild form. Not the dramatic kind people think of, but the subtle, everyday version. A sense of being a step removed from your own experience. It's common, it's protective, and it's reversible. But the deepest psychological layer is this. Numbness takes away not only your access to emotions, it takes away your ability to recognize your own needs. When you're numb, you stop reaching out. You stop asking for comfort. You stop acknowledging your fatigue. You stop admitting you're overwhelmed. Not because you don't need these things, but because the system has temporarily disconnected the internal signals that help you notice them. It's like walking through your emotional life with the lights off. And in the dark, you start to believe the wrong things. That you're unmotivated when you're actually depleted. That you're distant when you're actually overstimulated. That you're careless when you're actually in conservation mode. Here's something I've learned from studying people, and from being human myself. Numbness doesn't erase who you are. It silences who you are until it's safe to return. Your emotions aren't gone. They're waiting. They're resting. They're gathering strength in the background. And the moment your system senses genuine safety, the kind that doesn't demand performance, perfection, or resilience, the feelings begin to thaw. Numbness isn't an ending. It's a timeout. A pause your mind takes when the world has asked too much for too long. There's a question I return to often, both in my research and in my own life. What if numbness isn't the absence of emotion, but the echo of a life where you felt too much, too early, for too long? Most people look at numbness as a vacuum, an emotional blank space. But when you sit with it quietly, without trying to fix it or fight it, you begin to notice something deeper. Numbness has shape. It has texture. It moves. It responds. It isn't emptiness, it's information. One of the insights I've carried over the years is that emotional numbness acts like a psychological MRI. It reveals the parts of you that have been overloaded. It traces the outlines of the unspoken truths you've been carrying. It points, without words, toward whatever the rest of your mind has been avoiding. People often tell me, I don't feel anything anymore. But the absence of feeling is a feeling. The shutdown is a signal. And that signal often says, you've crossed the threshold of what a single nervous system can manage. Here's what psychology rarely teaches directly, but lived experience makes painfully clear. Numbness is not passive. It's an adaptation, a highly intelligent one. Your mind doesn't shut down emotions because you're weak. It shuts them down because, at some point, you were too strong for too long. If you peel the numbness back gently, with curiosity instead of judgment, you often find the same patterns beneath. The responsibility you carried quietly, the stuff you told no one about because you didn't want to add weight to someone else's already heavy world. The disappointments you adapted to instead of expressing, not because you didn't care, but because you cared too much. The constant internal monitoring, making sure you don't upset anyone, making sure you don't fall apart, making sure you're fine. People who feel deeply often learn to feel less, not because their hearts harden, but because their systems get tired. There's a metaphor I return to often. Imagine your emotional world as a vast field of tall grass. For most of your life, the wind blew through it, shaping, bending, rustling. You felt everything: joy, disappointment, hope, fear. Your system was responsive, alive. But then the storms came. Not one, not two, many. Years of wind turning into gales. And one day, the system did something brilliant to survive. It flattened the grass, stopped the movement, stopped the wind, stopped the feeling. Not because the field was dead, but because it needed a break from the storms. That's numbness, not a dead field, a protected one. There's another truth I've learned after listening to thousands of people's stories. Numbness often forms around emotions that were never allowed to be expressed. Anger that had no space, fear that had no witness, sadness that had no support, desires that felt dangerous, longing felt pointless, love that felt unclaimed. Every unexpressed emotion becomes weight, and weight accumulates. Eventually, the system shuts down, not because it's empty, but because it's full. This is why numbness can feel so confusing. You know you're overwhelmed, but you can't feel overwhelmed. You know you're sad, but you can't access the sadness. You sense there's something inside you, but you can't reach it. It's like standing outside a locked room, hearing faint movement on the other side. And here's the insight I want you to hold gently. Numbness is not the loss of your emotional self. It's the distance between you and the emotional self you had to protect. You're not broken, you're buffered, you're not disconnected, you're defended, you're not empty, you're suspended. One more thing, something personal. I've never met a numb person who wasn't, at their core, someone who once felt deeply. Sometimes, too deeply. People who grew up watching everything, noticing everything, absorbing everything. People who learned early how to carry emotional weight that wasn't theirs. People who became strong long before they should have. If that's you, numbness isn't your enemy. It's your system's reminder that strength has limits, even quiet strength, especially quiet strength. And if you listen closely to the numbness, not the silence itself, but the contours of it, you'll notice it doesn't say, feel nothing. It says, feel less, until it's safe to feel again. It's not a verdict, it's a pause, and pauses are part of healing. There's a perspective I want to widen here, something psychology hints at but rarely articulates clearly. Numbness isn't a single experience. It's a spectrum, shaped by different histories, different nervous systems, different forms of emotional survival. When we talk about numbness as if it's one thing, we miss its nuance. And nuance matters because it's the difference between misunderstanding yourself and finally seeing your inner world with accuracy. So, let's expand the idea. Most people imagine numbness as a flat line, no peaks, no valleys. But there are actually three major forms: each with its own psychological roots. 1. The numbness of overload. This is the version that shows up after long-term stress, burnout, caregiving pressure, chronic vigilance, or repeated emotional labor. It's the "I can't feel anymore because I've felt too much" version. Your system dulls sensation the way your fingertips numb after holding something heavy for too long. It's not quitting, it's fatigue. 2. The numbness of protection. This one is shaped by early environments where vulnerability had consequences. Maybe you learned that sadness made you a burden. Maybe anger got you punished. Maybe fear made you look weak. So your mind learned to turn down the emotional volume long before you realized what was happening. This numbness is like wearing armor you forgot how to take off. 3. The numbness of disconnection. This is the version rooted in dissociation, not dramatic dissociation, the everyday kind, the subtle drifting, the sense of watching yourself from a half step back, the feeling that life is happening around you rather than through you. This form is common in people who grew up in chaotic, unpredictable, or emotionally inconsistent environments. Your system learned to create distance for safety. Most people who feel numb are experiencing some blend of all three. And here's the part that often surprises people. Numbness almost never comes from apathy. It comes from too much caring for too long without enough support. The people who go numb are usually the same ones who once poured themselves into others, who tried too hard, who held too much, who stayed loyal, patient, self-contained, and strong long after their emotional capacity was exceeded. There's another dimension worth expanding. Your brain treats emotional intensity the same way it treats physical intensity. If you touch something too hot, your reflex pulls your hand away. If you face emotional pain that's too overwhelming, your system pulls you inward, away from feeling. Not because you're weak, but because your instincts are intact. And yet, numbness feels wrong, deeply wrong. Because humans are wired for emotional movement. We're built to feel. So when that movement stalls, the silence creates confusion. You begin to ask questions like, what's wrong with me? Why can't I feel anything? Why does life look normal but feel unreachable? These questions aren't signs of failure. They're signs of awareness. The first, faint signals of a system trying to reorient. There's a model often used in trauma psychology called window of tolerance. It's the emotional bandwidth where you can feel, think, and respond at the same time. Above the window is overwhelming. Below the window is numbness. And most people who live high-functioning lives are constantly pushed above the window until the system snaps downward to compensate. That downward snap is what you feel as emotional flatness. Here's a concept most people never consider. Numbness is a negotiation. Your mind is negotiating between the life you're trying to live and the cost of carrying its emotional weight. When the cost becomes too high, the system adjusts, quietly, automatically, without asking for permission. If you've ever wondered why numbness feels both protective and suffocating at the same time, that's why. It's the compromise your mind made in order to function. But here's the widening lens, and it matters. Numbness is not a permanent state. It's a phase of emotional metabolism. Your system is processing, digesting, recalibrating beneath the surface even when nothing seems to move. And just as the body heals in the quiet of sleep, the emotional system often heals in the quiet of numbness. One more expansion. People often think they must bring the feelings back. But in reality, feelings return on their own once the system senses three things: safety, space, and slowness. Safety tells your system, you don't have to brace anymore. Space tells it, you don't have to perform. Slowness tells it, you don't have to rush. When these three align, the thaw begins. Not suddenly, but gradually, like ice melting at the edges. And that's the truth numbness hides. Your emotions aren't gone. They're simply waiting for the conditions where they can return without hurting you. There's a moment in recovery that isn't dramatic, and maybe that's why people overlook it. It's not the moment you get your motivation back. It's not the moment you feel joy again. It's not the moment you suddenly become your old self. It's quieter than that, almost invisible. It's the moment when your system stops fighting you, when numbness isn't something you're trying to escape from, and emotions aren't something you're trying to force back. You simply allow your inner world to be exactly what it is: muted, uneven, slow, or incomplete. without turning it into a personal indictment. That's when healing starts. Most people think healing begins with action, but in reality, healing begins with permission. Permission to feel nothing, permission to not know, permission to not fix, permission to pause without guilt. When you give your system that kind of permission, something inside you unclenches. You create the emotional oxygen your mind has been gasping for. Recovery from numbness is not about intensity, it's about consistency. Small, steady moments when your internal world is allowed to exist without pressure. A lot of people expect a guide, a method, a sequence, a guaranteed formula. But inner thawing doesn't unfold in a straight line. It's more like the way spring approaches: a warm day, a cold day, another warm day, then frost again. Small contradictions that slowly tilt toward warmth. Your system heals in micro-adjustments, not declarations. And maybe this is the piece almost no one says out loud. Sometimes the first emotion to return isn't joy. It's grief, or anger, or a sadness so old you barely recognize it as yours. This isn't a setback, it's a sign that your emotional circuitry is coming back online. The first signals your mind sends back are often the ones that were suppressed the longest. That's why numbness lifting can feel heavier before it feels lighter. But heaviness is movement. It's your inner world thawing. It's life re-entering you in its rawest form. There's a practice I offer not as a technique, but as a gentle frame. Start paying attention to the smallest shifts, not the big ones, not the cinematic breakthroughs, just the subtle movements, the tiny sparks of aliveness. Maybe you laugh for the first time in weeks. Maybe you feel irritation. Maybe music stirs something faint inside you again. Maybe you find yourself drawn to a place, a memory, a scent you used to love. These are the early signals, the quiet knocks, of your emotional self returning. Another part of recovery is learning to reconnect with your body, not in a performative or forced way, but in a way that helps your nervous system recalibrate its sense of safety. A slow walk at dusk, warm water over your hands, the weight of a blanket, leaning against a doorway and feeling gravity. Breathing without trying to breathe correctly. Tiny physical gestures communicate safety far more powerfully than thinking your way into calm. And here's something I wish more people knew. Connection heals numbness even when you don't feel connected. Sitting near someone you trust, sharing the same quiet, not having to explain yourself, not having to act okay, letting presence be enough. Humans regulate in proximity, even muted proximity. Your nervous system listens to other nervous systems. Recovery is also recognizing that numbness isn't a flaw, it's a message. And that message often says, you've carried too much alone. The healing unfolds the moment you stop trying to outpace your own humanity. You don't have to be fully present to heal. You don't have to feel deeply to heal. You don't have to transform everything at once to heal. You simply have to stop running from yourself long enough for your system to exhale. And when you finally do, even if just for a moment, you begin to sense something underneath the quiet. A pulse, a warmth, a slow return. Healing rarely begins with fireworks. It begins with softness, and softness begins with permission. The deeper lesson hidden inside numbness is that your value was never tied to your emotional performance. You were never required to be inspiring, energetic, expressive, or endlessly resilient to deserve care. Numbness doesn't mean you're broken. It means you were brave enough to survive something that exceeded your internal capacity. When you stop treating numbness as a failure and start treating it as a signal, everything changes. You begin to understand that life isn't asking you to bounce back. It's asking you to listen, to recognize your limits not as weaknesses, but as boundaries carved by experience. There's a quiet dignity in admitting you can't keep going the way you have been, a strength in honoring what's true instead of what's expected, and a profound kind of courage in choosing gentleness over self-punishment. The lesson is simple, but not easy. You don't heal by becoming invincible. You heal by becoming honest. Honest about what hurts. Honest about what's missing. Honest about what parts of you still feel frozen. And once you offer yourself that honesty, you're no longer walking through numbness alone. You're walking with yourself, not against yourself. And that's where recovery quietly begins. There's a quiet moment that arrives after you've emptied yourself onto the floor of your own life. It doesn't make a sound. It just settles, like dust finally deciding where to land. Maybe you've felt it, that strange pause between who you were and who you're trying to become. A pause that doesn't cheer you on, but also doesn't drag you backward. It just asks one thing, almost too softly to hear. What now? Not what next. Not what's the plan. Not how do you fix everything you've ever broken. Just what now? There's a difference. We've been taught that healing is made of big gestures and loud declarations. A gym membership, a 90-day plan, a color-coded routine that promises to resurrect the version of you you've been grieving. But healing rarely arrives as a transformation. It arrives as a permission slip to exist without justification. It arrives as an invitation to unclench. Do not push yourself harder than the version of you from last year. To not perform stability just because people are watching. Do not smile out of obligation when your face feels made of stone. Healing starts small. Almost embarrassingly small. Like drinking water in the morning instead of scrolling. Like sitting by a window and letting your eyes rest on something far away. Like answering one message instead of all 10. Like washing only the fork and cup you need today. Tiny actions that wouldn't impress anyone, and yet they whisper a truth louder than any heroic plan. I am still here. And sometimes that's the only foundation you have. But foundations don't have to be pretty. They just have to hold. There's a point people rarely talk about. The moment when the pain doesn't vanish, but it shifts weight. It stops crushing you and starts sitting beside you silently. It's still there, but it's no longer the thing steering the wheel. And in that moment, you realize something quietly extraordinary. You don't need to return to who you were before the collapse. You just need to meet the person who survived it. The version of you who learned to function while exhausted, who kept going with a heart that felt half lit, who still cared, even when numbness tried to erase your capacity to feel, who still tried, even when effort felt like dragging your own shadow uphill. This version of you, the one sitting in the ruins, breathing, thinking, observing, isn't the weaker version. It's the more honest one. And honesty is where real healing begins, not from "I'm fine," not from pretending you don't care, not from smiling because it's easier than explaining the gravity inside your chest. Healing begins the moment you say, "I'm trying, but I'm tired. I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm here. I'm not okay yet, but I'm willing to stay." Staying is the quietest kind of courage, and maybe the most important. You don't heal by forcing yourself to feel better. You heal by giving yourself permission to feel exactly what's there, even if what's there is emptiness or confusion, or numbness that refuses to thaw on your schedule. Every emotional winter has its own timeline, but no winter is permanent, and your nervous system, the thing that once shut down to protect you, is also capable of thawing, opening, rewiring, relearning warmth. It just needs safety. Not pressure, it needs softness, not performance. It needs the smallest signals that you're not abandoning yourself, not again. So, if you're listening to this with that heavy stillness inside your chest, if your mind feels dim, or your heart feels muted, or your days feel like a long hallway you don't remember walking down, know this: you're not broken. You're not failing. You're in repair. A slow, invisible, intelligent repair that your body began long before you noticed. A repair that doesn't need perfection, only consistency, only gentleness, only the courage to show up, even quietly. And maybe that's the real ending here. Not a conclusion, not a solution, but a gentle turning. A turning toward the version of you that's been waiting, patiently, silently, beneath all the numbness. The part of you that still remembers how to feel. The part of you that hasn't given up, even when everything else went dim. The part of you that still believes, in small ways, that life can expand again. So take one breath, then one more. Let it be enough for tonight. The rest will come, quietly, slowly, in its own time.